Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Dynamite Shirt Printing, Kyle Metz. What a guy. He came on as a sponsor, and my primary use for him is drop shipping. So what that means is that I don't got to buy inventory. I don't got to buy a bunch of t-shirts. Kyle handles it all. So it's ordered online, and then he prints it and ships it, and he handles everything. And it works out for both parties. If you're looking for something else like general screen printing, he handles that. He does embroidery. He does direct to garment, DTG, which means you can do one-offs, and there's no minimum on that. Kyle's been able to help a lot of businesses that I've been funneling to him just to get going and to, start up. I mean, you don't want to order 100 t-shirts when you're just coming out the gate. And Kyle can handle small orders, large orders. He can handle everything you need. That's Dynamite Shirt Printing, and it's dynamiteshirtprinting.com. Go check it out. My favorite skate shop in the Valley, 5anddimeeaston.com. You can shop online or in store. Their address is 140 Northampton Street, Easton, PA. Their hours are Monday through Friday, 11 to 7, Saturday, 10 to 7, and Sundays, 11 to 5. They carry clothing, shoes, boards, accessories, and more. You can get complete decks down there. They got grip. They got some local clothing down there as well. I know a couple guys that came on the show that they're now selling stuff in store, and they're exclusive to Fucked. They are doing so much for the independent skate community. They're doing so much for the DIY. They're doing a lot in the area with skateboarding, and I couldn't be prouder to have them as a sponsor. Their story is incredible, from starting it when they were 18 and then coming back later in life to opening up what the store is that they wanted. And the two guys down there are just incredible. I can't say enough good things about them. I love that they're a sponsor, and they really help out in the community. And if you skate or want to support them, please go check them out locally. It is 140 Northampton Street, Easton, PA. Online, it is 5anddimeeaston.com. Please go check them out. All Valley Rooter, Jared LaBarba, friend of the show, childhood friend, Never Again Studios official plumber. 24-hour emergency services. 610-762-1656. That's 610-762-1656. They charge by the job, not by the hour, and they are 100% fully insured. They have free estimates. They also do installation and repair. They have a list of things. I can't go over them all on here, but you can find them at allvalleyrouter.net. All of Jared's services are on there. It's a beautiful website. You can contact him through that website. You can find out how to do, emergency services. Where should I call? Who should I contact? You can get all that there at allvalleyrouter.net. Free estimates, fully insured. Jared LaBarba. Check him out.
All right.
Never Again Radio episode. I have no clue. Welcome to Never Again Radio. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. How are you?
I reached out to you because I don't know how I stumbled upon your focaccia bread, which I didn't know you know Tim Fry.
He's my second cousin, technically.
Yeah, because I shared your stuff. I was like, yo, I got bread. He's like, how did you get that bread? And I was like, I hit her up and was like, can I buy your bread? So whenever I stumbled upon your social media, the first thing I noticed is like how clean and organized, and like you do a very good job of your point of view and your creativity on how you want your social media to look. And then I was like drawn in by that. And then the videos and reels. And then when I asked you, because I think I was just like, do you sell this? And you were like, I'll sell you some. So, yeah. So I creeped through the cemetery and I had it, and it fucking blew me away. And then I've been wanting to do this interview just to talk to you about how you even dabbled into that, because that's not something that I believe you've been working on that for a very long time. So how did you get into baking in general? Because did you start with focaccia?
I didn't. So what I do now is mainly like sourdough stuff. But in order to get there, I kind of started out with the typical yeast breads. So it's kind of a long story.
We have plenty of time.
It goes all the way back to when I was in college. So my junior year, I actually lived off campus. So I had to start learning how to like cook for myself.
Yeah.
Be a normal adult. So my dad is super good at cooking. So he would like take me to the grocery store, give me some pointers, like, oh, you can like throw this in your freezer, or, make yourself food preps, and like you have this for the week. So I started there, kind of like got the cooking piece of it narrowed down, and I was like, all right, I really like this. I was like a box mac and cheese girl for most of my life, and then I was like cooking, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I love it.
What was the first thing that you made that kind of opened the door?
Wow, that's a tough one. What was I kind of known for? I'm gonna have to think about it.
I got it. Well, the reason I asked that is when I hit the wrong button. I did a podcast with 4 videos and I just hit a blank screen. When I started getting into it, I lived with my brother in Virginia, and they didn't cook. He went out to eat all the time, and she did rice with ground turkey and stewed tomatoes. And I was like, I don't want to spend any more money, and this unflavored dish is terrible. So I bought Campbell's Supper Bakes, and it was a very similar thing where like I was watching the Food Network a lot, and it was like when you kind of get into it, you just kind of like, oh. And then the thing that opened the door is when I was making the Campbell's Supper Bakes, and then I realized that I can just get the ingredients in the box and I can do whatever I want with it. So I didn't know if there was like something specific where like, like you're making box mac and cheese, but then once you start getting into stuff, you're like, oh, I can make that from scratch.
Doctor it up. Yeah. Well, I'm a pasta girl, totally.
Yeah.
Like, so I started out with just like ridiculously cheesy pasta dishes, which, I mean, how can you go wrong with a cheesy pasta dish? Throw in like a protein, ground turkey, stuff like that. So I feel like that was kind of my niche that I kind of got into, was more of the pastas and the carbohydrates and the bread type stuff. It wasn't until I ended up dating this guy into my senior year, and when I went to go visit his family, his grandma actually, like, I still remember, she just like pulled out a Betty Crocker cookbook, opened it up. There was like a white bread recipe. She made it that day, and we brought it out of the oven, still warm, buttered it up and ate it. And I was like, holy shit. And that's where, like, I don't know why it never clicked in my brain that like people make bread.
That's why I asked that, because it's like, I was so foreign to cooking and I remember as a kid I made scrambled eggs. Like my brother taught me how to do that, so then he didn't have to do it. And then there was like stupid things where you thought, in my 20s I thought I knew how to make hamburgers and hot dogs, but then looking back on it, I was just burning everything.
Microwave.
Yeah. Or like not understanding temperatures and like getting into it. And then the more I got into it, it was like, oh, and then like when that kind of Pandora box opens and it makes sense, and you're a specific type of person, you'll just go down this rabbit hole of just endless, nonstop, like breads, bagels. And like when we started getting into the bagels, it's like I kind of left, like I held on and I kind of just pushed Gina down the hole and was like, I can't come with you because I have to pay attention to, because you could get lost. And then like you can spend years just working on one thing, and then your direction of food and everything is now baking, and baking is so different than cooking.
Absolutely.
So when you guys made that bread, what was that like for you to have that same day?
Well, it was just, I thought it was fantastic. And that was using a commercial yeast. So that was like,
you start learning.
Yeah. And like now I'm like, oh my God, it takes me 3 freaking days to make 1 loaf of bread. But at the time I'm like, this is amazing. Like there's no bread here. We can easily take this packet of yeast, water, milk, I think, flour, and that's it. And we can have a loaf of bread in a couple hours. Yeah. With no added chemicals or anything like that.
Did you get into bread makers at all before you really started getting into everything?
I didn't, because they use a lot of the yeast. And you mean like the...
Yeah, because my dad would just be, because I probably get a lot of it from my dad, but like I would get into making different things. So like he got an ice cream maker. And then so like for 2 months, until we were all burned out on ice cream, like till my mom hit it, because she's like, Henry, stop making ice cream. So like he would get a pasta maker, and then we would have fresh pasta, which is such a game changer. Then he got a bread maker, and then like would buy the packets and make it. But like he was always kind of disappointed because it like pumpernickel was always like, it never hit correctly. Like you could make your farm bread and it was like, oh, bread makers are cool. But like the pumpernickel, that was always his struggle.
That's what I think. I never tried a bread machine, but it got to a point where when I was using yeast, I still wanted more. And I was just kind of like, all right, what more can I do with this when I don't have a packet of yeast on hand, and like how can I kind of expand this and kind of fall further down the rabbit hole, and make it a little bit more, homemade even.
Yeah.
And that's how I got into sourdough.
Did you get into books or was it YouTube?
Oh my God, yeah, it was a mixture of both.
Yeah.
It was Joshua Weissman on YouTube. He's fantastic.
He's got a massive account, correct?
Yeah.
Where he like opens the cabinet
Yep,
door.
that's
Yeah,
him.
yeah.
Yeah, so I started watching him, and he
He makes it
like,
look so easy.
I
When he does
know,
the
and-
brioche rolls for like every recipe.
It is not
and then,
easy.
No, and then now that like I have a little bit of knowledge, I'm like, bro, that ain't going
Yeah.
like that. That is not going like that.
I tried for I was on, when I first started the sourdough, it was like 2 years. And it was just a hit or miss. Like sometimes I couldn't produce a loaf. It was whatever. And then I like completely gave it up and I became keto. So I wasn't eating any carbs. So I kind of like pushed making any type of bread that had carbohydrates in it down the drain.
Was that hard to do?
Yeah. And it was such a bad idea. I do not recommend it at all. Fuck that diet.
Yeah.
It was awful.
I tried it once, and the idea of it seemed good. And like I have friends that lose a lot of weight on keto, but then it's easy to put everything back. It's like anything else. There's a lot of stuff out there like that, but I don't know. It was. I mean, I just did something for 2 months, and I took bread out, and I couldn't do it. Like I went 2 weeks, and then I was like, we made bagels, and then I was like, we have to try these.
Yeah.
And then Gina was like, no, don't. And then like, we shouldn't, we're not supposed to. And I'm like, we're baking. Like we have to try this.
We have to try.
And then I gave the sandwich to someone and they were like, well, just to give you some criticism. And then I didn't have anything to explain because I didn't taste it. And then that was when I was like, no, I'm not living that way at all. How long did you do it for?
I was keto for, I think it was 4 months. And at the end, even I would like get so lightheaded, and like all the communities online were like, that's normal. Your brain's just operating at a higher capacity.
It doesn't feel good when you go into ketosis at all.
No, it doesn't. I was even like peeing on those little strips and stuff.
Yeah, when you get you were hardcore.
I was hardcore.
Would you fall into a keto cult?
Yeah, I'm very susceptible
What's that
to
cemetery
cults.
going on over
I know,
there?
very susceptible to the cults. I mean, I went from keto then to sourdough, which is essentially a cult. So.
Yeah. You're like, I'm going opposite.
Yeah, and now I did. I had to. Well, what I did was after the whole keto thing, I was like, all right, this isn't sustainable. I can't do this anymore.
What were you looking for? Like a life change? Or?
Yeah, I had broken my ankle, and so I gained a bunch of weight, and I just wanted like something to quickly drop the weight.
Yeah.
And so when you look online, that was one of the first things. It was during like the keto craze, I feel like.
Yeah.
So that was the first thing, and I was like, all right, let's do it. And I did it. I dropped 30 pounds, but I was freaking miserable. So I was like,
energy
I
levels
don't
are
even
real
care.
weird too.
Oh my God, it was awful. I had one martini, I remember, and I was like in the bathroom all night puking, and I was like, I can't live like this. I need martinis.
What kind of martini do you drink?
It was that one was a Cosmo.
Yeah.
But I'm into more of like gin drinks.
Yeah, gin martinis. I like dirty martinis. Like I started getting into that. Started getting into old fashions lately.
Here for the craft cocktails.
Yeah. So you go from keto to where are you at now?
Well, so part of that, when I was trying to come off of keto, and then I was like, all right, I still feel like I haven't found what my perfect lifestyle fit was.
It's tough to do.
It is. And I was turning 30, and I was like, I really want to focus on wellness. I want to get healthy. And as a part of getting healthy, I started researching like whole foods, minimally processed, cut out completely like artificial coloring and stuff like that. And so when you cut out a lot of the processed foods and chemically based things, you end up having to make a lot of your own food. So bread became a big thing when you start reading labels and stuff like that. I started you're at Wegmans, I flip it over, take a look, and I see they put like dough softener in there, and I'm like, all right, well, what the hell's in dough softener? Like, why do we need all this extra stuff? And then that's where I kind of came back to sourdough, because it was something that I can keep on my counter, my sourdough starter. I can feed it every day, and then I have discard to work with, so I can make a few things like crackers, stuff like that, and then I can have a loaf of bread at the end of the week.
You really utilize everything you're doing. I noticed that where you're like cleaning out the fridge, or you're like taking leftover stuff and making crackers, and you're not really like throwing it down. It seems like you kind of ran the gauntlet on like the best way for you to get the most out of what you're doing, which makes sense now with hearing you were making a lifestyle change. You just didn't start making bread. You were making bread with purpose. To explain to anybody, and just so I could get a little bit more knowledge on it as well, is like, explain what the starter is and all that, and like feeding it, because if no one understands that, it just sounds like you have like a monster on your counter.
And that's kind of like what it is. I mean, your starter is like your child. So when you're first making, because essentially your sourdough starter is a wild yeast culture. So it's similar to buying a yeast packet, but the packet is like dehydrated and commercially produced. So when you're making it yourself, you literally just start out with flour and water. And you let it sit on your counter, get the good air, the bacteria in the air gets into your starter. And then whatever's in the flour, it eats up with the flour and the water, and it starts to grow. So it does this process. If you have a brand new starter, it takes about 2 weeks to grow before you can use it in a bread to get a bread to rise. And during that 2 weeks, every day you're feeding it daily. So it is kind of like a monster because it has feedings.
Yeah.
Like they're called
So there's
feedings.
times it's like gremlins.
Absolutely. So right now, for instance, with my starter, it is probably about 3 years old now. And that's the coolest thing. When you look at sourdough history, is like over in Europe and stuff, they have starters that are like hundreds of years old, passed down through families. And it is just so freaking cool. I fell down that rabbit hole the one time. I was like buying dehydrated starter from this guy in San Francisco, and it was apparently like 100 years old, and I'm like, sign me up. I'm here. Let me try it.
It's like Discords for starters.
Yeah, it's crazy. But like, so you feed it every day the same weight of like, I do about 40 grams water, 40 grams bread flour. And eventually after 2 weeks, it starts rising on its own. And so there's 2 different states. It's either active or inactive. And when it's active, that's when you can put it in with a bread recipe and use it to make a loaf of bread that will rise. And when it's inactive, you can just essentially refeed it to get it back to the active state, or you can use it in a different recipe.
How do you tell if it's active or inactive on how it looks?
Oh yeah, it will literally be like bubbly, ridiculously high. I keep it in a jar, so like I usually put a rubber band around it and then I watch it double up. Yeah. So I know exactly when it's ready.
So when it's ready, what's your time window before you can use it? Or like when you use it?
You usually I try to use it within 3 hours of it being ready, because it all depends too on temperature, because it's still same like rising thing. So in the summertime, you have a little bit less time because it will start to drop then on its own, because what's happening is the flour is eating up, like it's essentially eating up all the sugar in there. And as it does that, it kind of falls down. So it doesn't have any more food. It needs that fresh flour in order to like kind of feed and grow. So usually, like right now it's winter, so I usually try to use it within 3 hours. And that typically works out for me. But then even when you use it, your bread itself doesn't rise like a normal yeast bread would. So like I think typically you sometimes can do them overnight if you're doing bagels or something like that. But this sometimes takes not only overnight, but then you put it in the fridge for a cold rise. And so it can sometimes take like 2 to 3 days just to produce one loaf of bread.
I have so many questions off of this, and I don't know where to go with any of them,
and
because I have like
them.
no, you're hitting a home run. So I just have questions from like the aspect of doing bagels, and then I have questions just for the interview in itself. So what is the difference between using regular store-bought yeast and actually the one that you would be using that you created, and how much does that change the flavor, and how much do you see a change as to using store-bought over making your own? So
personally, I feel like the flavor difference is huge, but that's just me. I think that the store-bought one is like a fast way to make bread. And I'll be honest, I do not know the science behind it. I'm not a science girly. I'm just a let's make bread and figure it out kind. So I don't really know the science behind the commercial yeast, but I know that that is kind of like the quick way to do it. Whereas in the traditional ways of making bread, you do have that sourdough starter. And in different cultures and in different styles of how they make bread, it's called something different. So I think like in Italian culture, and this might be totally wrong, I need like a little fact check. It's called like a biga. And then in other cultures, it's called poolish, but it's essentially the same thing. It's your starter, which is your mixture of flour and water that rises on its own.
Yeah. Because I've been talking to Modern Crumb, and we've been trying to come up with a process with the bagels so that basically, there's not a lot of research out there, which you probably know, and sometimes you look into something like bagels, it's impossible to find like how people do them all the time because it seems like it's a very kept thing. Mm-hmm. So we've been kind of discussing about like what we basically want is when, we come in the morning, the bagels are shaped and we did the cold rise, but we timed it to when they come out, then they can proof and then go in the water. So we've been messing around with trying to figure that out, and it hasn't been going in the direction we want. And Modern Crumb was kind of pointing out that it could be from using a regular starter and not using like the starter that you're talking
like
about.
Yeast.
Yeah, because then or the yeast or whatever. So like that's kind of been on figuring out what to do, but it's not like cooking where you can be like, oh, well, that's like using oil and butter and then you just kind of change flavors around. It's very difficult, in my opinion. That's why I've been so impressed with everything you've done, is like to move flavor around with baking is like moving numbers around and the science of it around in order to come up with a flavor in the correct direction. When you're cooking, you can do that in so many different aspects with adding butter and salt and cream and temperatures and moving it around. You can't really it's been fun trying to figure out how to do that, but now I know why people like yourself and other bakers I meet, where they open that door, and it's a very unique way of expressing your flavors, but it's done through science, which is way different than temping a steak.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
That's how, I know even from the sourdough starter perspective, when you're trying to change up your flavors a little bit, you can use different flours to feed it.
Yeah.
So I know the starter that I use right now, that one's primarily bread flour. So I only feed it bread flour, and that's the one I've been using for the last year. But it's 3 years old because it was actually given to me from my friend's mom. So my starter's from New Jersey, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
That's the other thing that I just love about sourdough is you can ask people for their discard, because when you feed your sourdough starter, you only start with 20 grams usually of the starter itself. So that means you have some that you end up getting rid of because you're feeding it 40 grams flour, 40 grams water, which is producing a much bigger, a lot more of volume. So when you go to feed it again, you only are taking 20 grams of that. So the rest of it just goes either in the trash, or you can upuse it in crackers and stuff like that. So if you ask somebody for sourdough discard, 9 out of 10 times, unless they have a secretive starter that they don't want to share, they will be more than happy to give you some.
Yeah.
So I know even when one of the places opened here in town, I saw that they had sourdough bread on their menu, and I was going to ask them if they had a sourdough starter so that I could potentially have some, because it's just easier than starting from scratch. Because like I said, it takes about 2 weeks, and when it's in the beginning phases like that, it's a weak starter still. So you're not going to see as good of rise levels as you would with an older starter. So when I was visiting my friend, I said to her mom, oh, hey, can I have some of your discard? And she was like, absolutely, totally excited to give it to me. And its name is Rona. She made it during the coronavirus pandemic. So it's about 3 years old now. And then I have that one. And then I have one in the freezer that is made from rye flour. So that one has a little bit of a different complex flavor when I use that one to bake, but I haven't used that one in a while. I actually hope it didn't die.
The other question I had was, now knowing that much about starters and what you're doing with that and seeing how much you can move the flavor around, it's very similar to when we changed up our flour. And then now that's when and I don't care if I hurt anyone's feelings saying this. I didn't realize we didn't have good bagels in Pennsylvania until we started dabbling in making bagels. And then I realized that we don't have good bagels in Pennsylvania. And then when you start realizing what goes into, and I only say this because we've been obsessively working on a bagel for probably 3 years. So it's like, and it's at a point where we're happy and we're proud of it. And we got a nod from New York, New Jersey, and a guy from Italy said, "This is good." And I was like, he left the room. Me and Gina were like, "Oh!" So yeah, very moment like that. They laughed and we just high-fived. But you know, when you start realizing what makes a difference in the taste and the flavor and everything, like anyone can make a bagel. Anyone can make a bagel from the ingredients they have in their home, and that's what we did. And we made a bagel out of boredom, and we used what flour we had, and then we were obsessed with why isn't this like another bagel? So that's kind of where the rabbit hole opened. And then when we went down it, I started contacting my friends through the podcast, Angelo and some Local Stone and some pizza guys, because I know they directly work with higher end flour. And then once I got into there, I found out that it was the gluten. And then once we got into the gluten, then we started getting a hold of just connections and stuff that you wouldn't normally get unless you ran a crazy thing like this and talked to a million people all the time. So there's like a network that is here that has grown. And if anybody really wanted anything, I have a friend who was like, "Hey, you got anybody who has a wrestling ring?" And I was like, "Hold on." And then like Chris over at LVAC be like, "Hey, do you ever rent your wrestling ring out?" And then I'm like, "Hey, Zach, I do have a wrestling guy." And he's like, "What the fuck?" And I'm like, "Here, talk to him." So like, it's cool to be able to go in that. But then once we got our hands on way better flour, it completely changed everything. Because we went from regular flour to restaurant store flour to stuff that is coming from Italy, and it's a manufacturer, and she's out of New Jersey, and like that changed everything. And then I was like, oh, and then like the more we kept dialing that in, and then the more we kept using higher end products and using different things, and like I understand why people say it's the water, but I still don't think it is. But like when you start using those better products, it completely changes everything, because the original bagel we made, you could probably throw through a window. Like it was a rock and it just sat in your stomach. And then like you start realizing where like we started using like conditioners and like things to clean it up. And then I was like, then like you start noticing that your stomach can digest the shit better because you're putting better things in it. Then you start learning about what's actually in the food you're eating. Very similar to kind of like what you went through, but what's it been like for you to kind of start getting into different things? Like, do you get into higher end flours? Where do you go with your flour? Because you're taking this much time with the starter, so you have to be crazy about your flour.
Yeah, so I only use organic flour. I do use King Arthur flour. They're my favorite store-bought.
That's what we started with.
Yeah, that's my favorite. That's the one that I can usually find at the store.
Weggies.
Yep. So I get the organic version of that. And when I forget what the brand is, it starts with an H. That's the rye flour that I've used in the past.
Is there another one, Red Hook or Red something? It's over in that section in Wegmans. Wegmans usually has like the small
I haven't expanded
stuff
to any of the other ones. I was really excited though, because we have friends that my husband and I have friends that live in Vermont. They have a farm up there. And when they were just visiting over the holidays, they were talking about possibly growing some like wheat and everything. And I was like, all right, this is my perfect excuse to get. KitchenAid has like an attachment that you can mill your own flour.
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, I'm ready. Like, just give me the grains. I'll mill it, and I want to make bread out of that. So that's like my next goal, to just be able to go full circle and even mill my own flour and then use that.
How long did it take you to find the flour and like the recipe that you primarily use for this?
It was a lot of trial and error. The flour I've always used King Arthur flour. I did up it to the organic one just based off of the YouTube recommendations. And that, I feel like when you use organic, it has more of that like good bacteria in it. So it helps your starter grow faster versus, taking a little bit longer to get those good rises. But I think that it's been taking me, I've been working on this recipe for my focaccia. That one was like about a year. And I do have to play with different hydrations when it's like warmer outside. Like
That's
now,
a lesson
this,
learned.
oh my God, this winter threw me off bad. Like I remember the first time it got really cold and I tried to make bread and I was like, oh, what the hell? Like took an extra day. I was like, this is not cool.
We did a pop-up, and I think it was the first time we were selling the bagels through Instagram, and I just put it out there, and I think we sold like 300 bagels in like 15, 20 minutes. And I was just like, because I've been like, I tease a lot with like food and like how we've been opening, but like if you do that correctly, you're selling a want, not a need. So it's like I learned that through apparel with like, you got to emotionally attach people to this stuff. So like, you know, when you start getting, oh my God, those bagels, when are you going to sell them? And then when I did that, Gina's like, we can't make anymore because we're just doing them out of our house. She's like, you lunatic, what are you doing? Like, that was such a lesson because we had to get up at like 2 a.m. to start making these because we were making them day of. But I remember the one day we did it was like super muggy out and we were like pulling all of the stuff out and like, because we bought a proofer and we put it in the basement and like, that was like kind of, we wanted to learn how to proof and like what we would be doing at the restaurant. So we would bring them up and then like we were timing them for when like they would, when it was fall, you could leave the dough out and then we would shape them and boil them. But then we were trying to do that. And I remember like Jer's cutting grass and it's like the middle of summer and they start turning into softballs and we're like, what the fuck are we? So like it was crazy because like that was the first lesson where people talk about it, where they're like humidity and everything and like how the kitchen is, and you're like, yeah, all right, because you don't experience it if you're in a season that it doesn't affect it. But then like in the summer it was wild to be like, you know, the taste was still there, but then like how they look changed. So like they came down, but then you got like creases and bubbles and like when you're trying to kind of, you know, we weren't happy with how the bagel looked, but we were okay with it still had the taste that we nailed down for it. So like when you start getting into the humidity issues and like baking in an uncontrolled temp, even in the kitchen, because like with building out the new one, you know, there's things we can do like with like the ventilation system to try and control the temperature of the kitchen, but like it's still impossible in the summer. Like you're in a kitchen.
Yeah.
So it's like always, that was kind of one of the first, it's funny when you run into it because I feel like with baking, it's like you're like in it for like the long haul and it's a very stressful,
It's so
like
stressful.
it's a stressful long thing where like cooking, it can be done and then it's over and then you get to do it again. And but like there's a little bit
You have to
leeway.
commit.
Yeah, where with baking, it's like, and then there's a lot of like, is this fucked up? Did this rise correctly? Even now, it's like, we're trying to just do the cold rise and all that. And it's like, we can't get it down. And I'm like, man. And then like you forget because usually what happens is like, we call them like, or I'm like, hey, like it was a good bake. And then like Gina's like, yeah. And then like we'll get ones where we make a bagel and it doesn't work at all. And then like there's so much work to start all over. And I'm like, it sucks when there's like a bad bake. And she's like, it's not a bad bake, we're learning. And I'm like, no, like this sucks.
Yeah,
Like
I've been there.
And you take it personally where I'm like, man, like I wanted to figure that out. And like that's my obsession with baking is like it's problem solving to get to what exactly taste you're going for. And then it's not like, hey, just put another cheeseburger on and see if it would needed more mayo. Like it's an entire process of starting back from square one.
commitment.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I started a bread diary when I first kind of started getting into sourdough and stuff like that, just to jot down notes. So anytime I fed my starter, I would write down the different grams that I used. Anytime I would bake anything, I would write down the exact measurements because it's so true. Like there is no worse feeling than spending a whole day putting a dough together, and then especially with sourdough, because there's a lot of stretching and folding. Not with the focaccia, but when you're making like a regular, I guess they call them like a boule, the round loaves, you gotta stretch and fold that shit like every half hour. It's crazy. And like
While the dough's rising?
while the dough is rising,
Damn.
like before it hits the bulk fermentation, that's when it can sit a couple hours. But before that, you're doing like I set a little timer on my watch because every 30 minutes I got to go do a little stretch. And that's when you can kind of feel it out, see if it got the little window pane, because the gluten starts to form the structure of the bread. So you can kind of get a feeling for how close it is to getting to that state when you'd be able to like throw it in the fridge then for the cold rise. But it's a commitment to do all that work and then to like bake it the next day, and you find out it's like overproofed or something, and it just like, it doesn't taste like shit, but it looks like shit, and you're just kind of like, oh.
And especially if you're trying to, like we talked a little bit before about like selling it to people, and then like it's tough because like even with like doing the burgers and stuff, it's like I know there's a window in there where like I could kind of fuck that up a couple different ways because I'm really the only one that knows that it's when it's perfect. So like it's everything. It's the onions to the bread feel to like how it sat in the wrapper. Like, you know, it's like when you go to Potsy's and you get the hot dog kind of like steamed and it's like a whole experience. Like that's a similar thing that I was trying to do with the burger. So like even when it's not correct, it's like I still know when it's not right, and it's tough sometimes because I'll be like, man, that food sucked, and everyone's like, dude, this is so good, and I'm just like, I don't know. I feel like it's like you're personally just chasing perfection, which is never possible because every situation is so different and every minute of it is so uncontrolled and it's very fucking wild, and then it comes down to this thing, and you can get close every time, but I feel like it's very hard to hit that same thing every time.
Hard. You have to try not to beat yourself up. Like I know I'm really bad at it because I make bread for my family every Friday. So
yeah, when I first picked that up, I was like, "Is this a problem?" And you're like, "No." They're like, "This is what I do Fridays."
Yeah, Fridays. My parents always have had like this open house structure with my family, so we all kind of go there. My dad makes dinner, we hang out, drink, and it's always a really good time. So my thing has become making bread. So I'll always like stroll in with my loaf of bread and I'm like, oh, it's overproofed. I did this wrong, or it didn't get the rise that I wanted. And they're like, what are you talking about? This is awesome. Like, this is delicious. So I always try to tell myself, unless I'm like selling it, because that does put like an extra, puts a little bit more pressure on. But I'm always like in my head, like, at the end of the day, if it still tastes good, it's okay if it's not as aesthetically pleasing.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, with the guys, they'd come down because like how I got back into cooking was we watched the UFC down here. So it was like a grown men's crock pot party where like everybody would bring like after we did it a couple times, I'm like, dude, this is so, I'm like, we might as well be watching Dallas. Everybody enjoyed cooking. So like my friend Tim would bring something, Dustin would bring buffalo chicken dip, and it was like there was always a lot of people here in the beginning, so like we always were cooking. So I was just making food for them. And as soon as they would come down, I'm like, they're overcooked. And my one buddy would be like, shut up, dude. He's like, this is 10 times better. And Gino is reminds me of that when we get in a situation where I was like, we'll be driving home and I'll be like, do you think anyone liked our food? And she's like, dude, what are you talking about? But like she gets that way when she does the bagels, and I get that way when I'm cooking. But a lot of times we're always like, hey, like we're so overly obsessed with this that like you could dial that back 3 times, make a couple mistakes, and it's still way better than most of the shit anybody has because you care too much about it.
So true.
Because when you don't give the extra to it and you don't research it and you don't start trying to make it better and push it and change it, like I feel like you're trying so much that you can't, like it's hard to not make it good because you're caring so much unless you completely mess it up. But you know what I mean? Like we've never really ran into a situation where people were like, hey, your food was horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, people had the bagel originally and were like, this is so good, and I would say that was like a little bit better than what's around here. But and I'm not just saying this to toot my own horn or anything, but like where we have pushed this is like people from out of the area are like, how did you do that? And then I was like, man, like this is way fucking different than kind of where anything's at around here. So it's like we could have left it where it was and been on par, and everyone would have been like, oh, it's awesome, we like what you're doing. But then we have people who try it now where it's dialed in and we're just baking, we're not doing that, and they're like, holy shit.
Yeah.
And then when you find out you can freeze it, and then it's like, oh wow, there's so many different areas of what it can do. How have you been with getting it out there? I know you don't really push it a lot, and like people will be like, "Where do you get that bread?" And I'm like, "Hit her up; she might make it for you."
I do. Like, if people reach out, I usually will make an arrangement to sell them.
You're gonna be like, "Cut that out of the podcast."
The thing is I have 3 pans.
Yeah.
I just got a 3rd bread pan.
Because I offered to buy you the 4th, because you were like, "Here's the flavors I have," and I'm like, "But that's just typical me." I'm like, "Give me one of each," and you're like, "I only have 3."
I got 3 pans.
Yeah.
So it gets tough like around holidays because I obviously will put my family first.
Yeah.
So like family reaches out if they need something, they got it. But yeah, I haven't figured out how to like freeze it and stuff yet. So that's where it's kind of tough and it's hard to sell because I'm also just working out of my home kitchen.
Yeah.
So with the proofer, even I have just a regular standard bread proofer. So I can fit my 3 pans in there and that's it. So that's getting me through the winter. During the summer, I can kind of have a little bit more room to make more, but still it's a little tough. So that's where I haven't explored freezing or bulk baking. I did start looking into like a big oven because I was like, this might be cool to like throw in my basement and just have like a freaking little mini commercial bread oven. But I don't know. I still
You can
haven't
find that
decided.
stuff used too.
Yeah.
There's a lot. We went down the rabbit hole of how we did it was like, let's do pop-ups and then let's take the money and invest it back in. So like the proofer we got wasn't cheap. And like the other thing I was going to ask you about is your mixer. So like we were just using a basic mixer, and then to get anything other than the KitchenAid. So like we wanted the commercial one, which is like the final one they make, but it's not cheap. So I was like, hey, let's try and sell bagels to pay for that. And then like that's kind of like how we grew our equipment, whether we were going to use it for because if it was at home, you can still use it and it's just a little bit easier, but it's bigger equipment.
Yeah.
And like the proofer just fit down there, but it also doubles as a warmer. So we looked at it as if we ever would open, we would be using this. So then like the mixer was the first thing we bought. And then after the mixer, I was like, let's get a proofer because then we can start figuring out the bagels a little bit more. And that's kind of, we didn't buy any of that stuff to sell more. We just built it to see a small version of like commercial at home. So I see where you're saying like, and you seem like the type of person that you would do that.
This
and
is
like
my
buy,
mixer right here.
Yeah, like you would buy the so you don't use a
not for sourdough.
Yeah.
For bagels you have to because
Yeah.
you need that tough dough.
Yeah.
It's like that more firm dough, but for this stuff, no, this is actually for the focaccia, it's nice because you actually don't have to stretch it either. You could like literally mix it and forget about it and just address it in the morning.
Yeah.
It's the easiest bread to make. That's why I only sell that one.
Yeah.
Because the other ones are a lot more tough and they take a lot more time to do.
So the focaccia is the only thing you have kind of like pushed publicly to like friends and family to do you get a lot of people that constantly hit you up for it?
I do. I get a decent amount, which is hard because of my schedule and like the size of my kitchen and stuff. So I try to make time for people, or I just let them know like, I have some time next weekend. Can we do next weekend?
Yeah. I really hope you do get a commercial oven to put in your basement.
Maybe.
I just feel like it would push and grow and change everything more. I mean, the minute I had it, I was like, you should definitely like open and sell that. And then like, I started getting to know you more and you're like, well, this is my career and this is what I do. And then you see why it would be hard to kind of switch things up. What do you want to do with it?
I don't know. I'm torn between, I sometimes want to just take like an educational route with it. So like share my discard with people. That sounds so funny to say, to share my discard or to like, give people tips on it. And then I was thinking about maybe potentially growing my social media on that platform of like educational wise, but there's like so many people doing that I was just kind of like, get lost in the sauce. So then another thing I thought of is like maybe if I do eventually buy a commercial oven, maybe opening up a website and just doing like a set amount of orders on one day. So like if I sell bread on Fridays and Sundays and just, have make a set amount, 20 loaves, let's say, and put the slots out there and then people can purchase them and then come pick them up.
It's the best way to do it.
Yeah, that's what I figured I would probably eventually go into. it's just really hard with my job because I do have a full-time job where I'm working. And I know even just recently I haven't been able to post like a lot of reels and stuff like that. I haven't had time to kind of pour into the creative part of it because of work. So that's where it kind of gets tough.
Yeah. I was in food. I'm trying to think. I was in food for a very long time, and I got out of it, and then I didn't like, I didn't like where anything was with food, and I didn't even do it at home. Like I was just kind of burned out from it. And then when I got back into it, I met the guys who were coming on the podcast that were doing pop-ups. And then when I started doing the pop-ups, you take control, and like if I just want to sell 50 hamburgers, like going to the bars and stuff, you bring what you want, but like doing it where the pre-orders and like doing it how you want to do it with like, hey, this is what I have and this is what I can make. I started really getting a lot of interest in Netflix, and a lot of places have a lot of awesome shows on people who control their own food. A lot of problems with the restaurant industry, and what happens in Nazareth is like people open and then they let people dictate what should be done in their restaurant. And then you take somebody's vision or somebody's expressive talents and you kind of change that, and then it usually disrupts and ruins the person's business. And I feel like sometimes people have too much control over what they want with your product, and then the demand's there. And then I watched this there was a couple different documentaries, and one was on a guy who made pizza, and he worked in the industry his whole life, and it was crazy. And then he opened up his own shop, and he has a product that is super demanded, and what he does is he makes enough every day for how much money he needs to live. And then I was like, oh, that's so genius. So he comes in, and his day in the morning, it's him and one other guy, and they put all their effort into this fresh ingredients, and they make pizza, and they open at 11, and they only sell whether it's 50 or 80 pizzas a day, and then they shut it off. And if you're not in line to get their food, which is a sellout every day, you don't get it. And that's all the money he wants to come in, because that pays his bills, and he has money for his family, and he took all the stress and the bullshit out of it. And I was like, that's the best way to do food, because you get controlled by people too much. And I know people that run restaurants, and their life is just dedicated to it's the same old song and dance of why people tell you not to do it.
Yeah.
And when we open, it's gonna, there's a lot of stuff that I want to do, like when, because we're not going to do the burger right away. And if we do Studio Kitchen at night, it's like, that's how I want to do it. Like if you don't follow me on social media and you don't understand what I'm doing, I'm not, I'm only making this many. And like, you can come here and have this experience, but like, I'm not going to make 1,000 cheeseburgers every Friday night because people are telling me I should do it.
Yeah.
When my life then is, it's very hard to do a full-time job and bake like you are now, let alone if you would start doing it. But I think it'd be an awesome way to introduce doing it if you went down that avenue, because then you got to choose your passion and what you love doing over a career which you worked hard on. And then it's
that's where it's, because like I don't want to ever lose that passion either, because
it gets weird when it turns into work.
Exactly. And right now, when I think about making a loaf of bread, I just think about my Saturdays. So
it's
like
an escape.
Yeah, it is. I always tell people like, oh, you're depressed, you should like look into making sourdough, because it is so humbling. And then at the end of the day, you have a product that you created.
I'll get into a funk sometimes, and I'll be like, why don't you cook something?
Yeah.
And then I'll be like, all right, what do you want to cook? And then I'll be like, I'll make a list, and I'll get in my van and go down to Wegmans and pick up a couple things. And when it's done, I play music, and then like I take a bite of the thing, and I'm like, that's like, I'm like getting like dopamine drops from making food, because I love taking something out of my head. Well, like it was always hard for me to create because I wasn't like artistically talented like my brothers, or I wasn't. So like I fell in the category as almost like the run of the group that couldn't figure stuff out. So then when I figured out how to create by doing stuff like this, which is like earlier when I was like, I don't
that is like so spot on.
So,
I tell people the same
thing. So it's like I can only create by doing this, because I can't take it from my head and put it on paper. So like when you get into cooking, it's a very similar outlet where I can make a burger that I know all those flavors are going to go together. I can make a sandwich, and then like that's why I like working with Local Stone. And when you find people like that, you can start like you know that they're also taking flavors out of their head and putting it into a project, and then like you can change somebody's mood that way. And like
It's your art.
yeah, so like when I started doing that, it was a very big outlet. But then it gets rocky where like I push this to a point where it is a job and I have to depend on making it, where now it's like I took probably a month off from interviewing anybody until today, and then I'm like, man, you're much sharper. Like you want to do this. It's not, you're not right. You're not just calling it in where it just happens because you're in the repetitive motion of it turning into a job. And then sometimes I'm going to be, I have to be like, hey man, like this still really isn't work. Like you have to like, you got to like kind of shake it. So it's like, it's tough to push somebody to be like, that's why I asked you, because I didn't know what you did. And I was like, yo, you want to make this part-time and sell it at the coffee shop? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a very special thing to the point of like, I didn't know if you'd come on here because you don't push this, and it's not something that like, you put it out there, but it's not like you're like,
I'm
hey,
just a girl in my house making bread.
Yeah. That's what I always tell people when I'm like, I'm like we're talking about like doing like the signature series stuff, and like I'm trying to find a different way to start making content doing food. And my buddy's like, well, why don't we could do this and this, and I'm like, oh, there's this girl in town and she makes this focaccia bread, and I'm like, we could do this, and they're like, what? And I'm like, yeah, she sells it. What's funny is like when there's somebody I know that has something very unique, and I know the story will sound cooler by making it different than what it actually is I really pitch that like the whole cemetery thing, and I'm like, yo, she sells it out of a cemetery.
It's a part of my vibe.
But you know what I mean? But it's like you go to your porch, but I'm like, no, I bought this in a cemetery. So that's how, and I know that like you throw those vibes in there. So like I definitely push you as like the cemetery bread girl.
This gothic cemetery bread girl.
Well, I knew you wouldn't care.
No,
you know what I mean?
I
Like,
love it.
You push it out that way. Where do you want to do more with this other than kind of like build your kitchen out? Like, what are you getting into cooking besides focaccia? Like, are you getting into anything new? Are you doing different stuff?
I am actually. So my next challenge that I want to start working on is croissants.
Oh.
But sourdough croissants.
That's cool.
Yeah. And I just kind of like, that's the fun thing about bread, right? Is like there's so many different kinds of bread. So now that I feel like I've kind of mastered what I look at as focaccia bread, I want to move on and like explore croissants and definitely baguettes, but all using sourdough.
Yeah, we tried starting to do that, and it was cool because like you kind of start getting into the different versions of bagels, and it's hard for us because we're infusing everything into the dough, and I'm sure where you start getting into that, where you start putting acidic things in and things don't rise correctly. So we're still learning a lot of like why people don't do it that way, and they just put a bunch of shit on top of a bagel. But we don't want to do it that way, and you can do it. You just have to figure out moving the numbers around. So then when we started getting into like the one day I just rolled the dough out, and I was like, hey, we can do this for like, we just did like a roll up. I don't know if it's like a stromboli or whatever it's called, but like my buddy used to make these pizza rolls. Like I would just stay at his house all the time, and we'd get high, and he would just get frozen dough, and we'd just make these pizza things, and he started getting really good at it. So sometimes I just kind of mock that version, but I did it with the bagel dough. And then when I realized that like we could use that bagel dough for way other things besides bagels, then we started getting into trying to make bagel baguettes for sandwiches. And then I'm like, oh, we can go down this. And then like now you have something that you took almost like a mastery of, but you didn't even get into it yet, because you can turn that into like, that's where it really turns into you're never done.
I love it. Like even with the focaccia dough, if I let it rise on a flat pan and kind of like a thinner style, I make tomato pie out of it.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic.
Yeah.
And it's the same exact dough. So I can kind of like make it overnight and then in the morning decide kind of where I want to go with it.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Did you get into like what else? How did the bagels come out? Because I do want to trade bagels.
They're good. I mean, I definitely don't. I'm still like kind of playing around with the recipe. I feel like they get hard really fast.
Yeah.
But that might just be the bread in general.
It's tough because you go through that whole thing where you don't know how to kind of store them and what to do with them. And then like if you sell them to somebody, that's where I get a lot of like insecurities where I'm like, well, if this person puts this shit out on the counter, it's going to turn into a fucking rock.
Yeah.
So it's like, we're getting better with like, hey, like Gina does basically all of the baking in the sense of like she knows everything because she's making bagels for the kids and like stuff like that. So it got to a point where, you know, like we know now, like, hey, you need to store that overnight in like a Ziploc bag, but all that shit changes with the weather too.
It does. I get so self-conscious.
Yeah,
I always
it's
tell
crazy.
people, like, I'll hand them the bread and I'm like, listen, if you're going to eat it today, that's beautiful. I recommend that. But if you're saving this for tomorrow, toast it. Because even if you store it airtight, it is not going to taste as fresh as it does the same day. But when you toast it, it's fantastic.
Yeah, because I bought so much off of you. I think I bought 3 the first time.
Probably 2.
2, yeah.
I just got my third.
Yeah. So you only had 2, but I mean, that was so much for one person.
Yeah.
And then I was like, what am I going to do with all this? Because in the beginning, I'm like, I'm going to eat it all. And then, like, I ate it. And then I was like, fuck, this is a lot. So I gave some. Everyone I gave it to thought it was awesome. And then, like, I also wanted to just share it with people because I was so pumped we have something in Nazareth. I don't care that you don't legitimately sell it. I have access to it. So, like, I was just excited to like, be able to walk down the street and get that. And then it lasted longer than I thought it would because I think I did it similar to the bagels where I kept it in a Ziploc bag. So like I kept it overnight in a Ziploc bag, but I ate a little bit of it every day, and I wasn't expecting day 4 for it to taste like anything because it's similar to the bagels.
And the nice thing is the focaccia is high hydration, so it has more water content than it does flour. So a lot of times that lasts a little bit longer. It doesn't get as hard as like a bagel that has more of like a lower hydration.
The bagels, the early ones were just rocks. Like now it kind of like, Gina says sometimes she prefers them the next day, but like you definitely have to Ziploc them, and there's like a whole like, which is now going to be a thing that like I have to print out and give to people.
Yeah,
like that's probably going to be but then eventually I probably year 2 I'm going to be like, I don't care.
My first batch of sourdough bagels, my husband broke his tooth.
Oh my God.
He literally broke his fucking tooth, and I felt so bad. And I don't think it was all like due to the bagels, but they were a little.
Yeah,
hard.
It's tough. And then like you have to just keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it till you get to a product like that.
Yeah.
I did a sandwich with that and it turned out awesome. Do you mess around with doing stuff like that a lot? Or like what is your go-to for kind of, because how we did it is I believe I cut it and then I toasted both sides down and then I had an egg sandwich with it, but it was ridiculous.
Yeah, so I've done that with breakfast sandwiches. I know the one weekend I kind of popped all the bubbles on the top before I baked it to make it a little bit flatter, and we sliced it down, and my dad got just like a bunch of Italian cold cuts.
Yeah.
And we just made like our own sandwiches on there. That was fantastic. I've even already sliced a leftover one and then made like a little next day pizza on top of it.
Yeah, I
and,
was
like,
going to ask if you messed around with I mean, I know you said the tomato pie, but do you get around, like, what do you do for your flavors? Like what, because I know you have like your common ones that you do.
Yeah, the ones I usually sell is roasted garlic, rosemary and sea salt, or the olive. So because those are just kind of like easy to throw together and make. I do a lot of pizza style ones for my family. So like I'll throw sauce on there, and like I've already done some, the one that my sister really loved was just like a pizza style. So I had some spicy sausage on there, roasted red peppers and mozzarella. It's fantastic.
Do you bake the mozzarella in at the end, or do you kind of put it on like do you take the ingredients there and make it on already made bread, or is it something that you finish so it's in the bread like how the stuff is there?
I do it, what I usually do is I put a layer of mozzarella on the bottom, like the shred it, like directly on the top, and then I bake it that way, and then I take it out about 10 minutes before it's done and put the fresh on so that it's just kind of melty, but it doesn't exactly soak into the bread. But that layer, the base layer, I always put that on because it kind of separates the dough from the sauce, and then it doesn't get too wet.
Did your family push you to open? Does your husband push you to open?
I
feel like you probably get it a lot.
Yeah, we've talked about, because like we're both really big hobbyists, so like we're into tons of stuff. He's really into gaming, like board games and everything. So we talked about like how cool it would be to open a cafe in town that does like bread and board games, stuff like that. My parents, they kind of push me to it, but I think they're kind of like, it's a lot of work.
And you have a career.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're like, they don't exactly push it, but sometimes like my dad will be drunk and he'll be like, this is really good fucking bread. And I'm
It
like,
is.
yeah, you don't think I could sell it? Not saying that he doesn't have the confidence in me, but I don't know.
You should do a pop-up.
That's how many loaves of bread, how many pans would I need?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing about it is you can control it.
Yeah.
So you could, could you just sell half of them? I mean, I could go down a rabbit hole.
That's true.
Yeah.
So I did explore using smaller size pans, just to kind of like be able to create more. So, because I could fit like 4 of the small ones in my oven, and then I have 4 loaves of bread as opposed to I can fit the 3, but it's uncomfy. So I'm like, all right, so if we go down on size a little bit, then I can fit more. But there's just like something about the cake size. Like I use a cake pan.
Oh, it's perfect.
And I just feel like it's perfect.
Yeah.
So that's my
Yeah, and I guess the more
one.
I think about it now and I kind of go back to like what our problems were, you would have to time that. I mean, because how long does it take to bake one?
I usually do 30 minutes.
Yeah, so like you would have to just keep cranking those out super early in the morning or to do it, you wouldn't be able to do it on time.
And then I'd have to stage my rising too, because right now I kind of like base it off of, even when I make 3 loaves, because I know I can fit them all in my oven, I proof them all at the same time.
Yeah.
So they bake at the same time too. Whereas I'd have to almost change my proofing times. I'm not good at math.
That's what sucks is I'm not good at math. And when Gina and I took on the venture of doing this and then we started trying to do math, I looked at her and I go, fuck. And she goes, what? And I go, we're both stupid. She just started laughing. And I go, I was hoping you were decent at math. I go, I am terrible at math.
Really
I'm still using fingers and toes. I'm doing like tips at restaurants and I'm like, 1, 2, 3.
There's
People are looking at me.
There's going to be a professional baker out there watching this going, this girl thinks she knows sourdough, but like I'm just your average everyday person.
But that's how we are.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We didn't, and I don't think I'm anything other than that. I correct anybody who says I'm not otherwise. I was never schooled on anything, and I learned underneath chefs, and that's why it was part of the interest I wanted is you're not down that classically trained atmosphere, and this is a hobby that has just turned into an obsession that's turned into something that is artisan, and you could sell it, but then looking at all the problems, you technically wouldn't be able to do it unless you had a pizza oven set up. Like you'd be able to do it out of the coffee shop when we open, but to do that out of your house, I don't think it would work.
Yeah.
I don't know. You'd have to grow it to the point where you bought the oven in your basement.
I know.
And then that's when it
I
would be a
love
whole
a
nother
pizza
obsession.
oven though. I really would love a pizza oven. That would be crazy.
Yeah. They're out there. I mean, we look for equipment all the time. I mean, you can get new ones decently priced because you would probably get one deck, because that's what we're buying is essentially pizza ovens. I wanted something that was universal, but we wanted to take like the Canadian aspect of it and using the bagel boards, and like so we're going to be using bagel boards, so I can do 9 bagels on, I think it's 9 to 10 bagels per board, and then so we could essentially
Never seen a bagel board before.
It's basically it's a piece of wood, and I believe it's a cedar plank they use, and then they wrap it in burlap, and then you wet it, and then it's supposed to bring the flavors of the cedar up, and then it stops it.
Too, probably. Nice.
Yeah, and then it steams it a little bit, and then halfway through you flip it over, and then it's also a very fast way of loading your oven. So essentially, if done correctly, we would be able to make 300 bagels in under 20 minutes.
Nice.
So that's kind of like, and that's 3 decks. So, we were getting, almost 90 bagels out of each deck. So there's a lot that goes into it, but like then once it's flipped over, then you're using the paddle board and pulling them out. But we like the pizza stone. Mm-hmm. So we're not buying a bread oven. I mean, when I started talking to the lady, like we're kind of the first people that are using their pizza oven for bagels, but they also have the steam injection in it, so you can make breads in it. So then in the beginning I was like, I don't know if we need all that, and then now where we're at, we're like, yeah, let's 100% do that, because now we're talking about making breads and things that are not done the same way as bagels. We're not boiling them, and then like when we made because we tried doing the baguettes and they're super dense because it's bagel, but then at the same time it's like, all right, well, we can change that, but then we also needed to put water in there while it was baking. And then it's like, all right, well, you know, like, why wouldn't we get this 3-deck oven that kind of hits everything?
Yeah.
But that's when you start getting into a totally different rabbit hole of now you're talking
so
about
much.
making that. Yeah, that's why I offered it to you, because I was like, Gina had it and she was like, we could totally sell this on Sundays. And what I want to do is like, I don't want to get 15 off of those. Like, if you can make 6, it's like, cool, I sell 6. If you're not, like, my big thing is like, if you don't show up there when we open, you can't get your hands on any of the stuff that's like special and unique. And like, I want it that way. I don't want to have to make way too much of something and burn out on it. Like, it's for Nazareth. If you can walk there, you're the first person who can get it. So that's the part of living in town that you get, is you can walk to this place and get it when it opens. And if you're like how Calandra's cheese used to be, I don't know if you ever went over there, they would sell out, you know what I mean? They were cash only. So like when we lost that, you look back on it and didn't know how much that was Nazareth. Like, Nazareth was known for the cheese.
I miss Calandra's cheese every day.
My mom went to medical school. My mom's a nurse, and so is Jason's. I know Jason, but Mrs. Calandra, that would be who ran it with her husband, Wolfer, she was a nurse as well, and she went to nursing school with my mom. And years ago, she would say, my boyfriend makes this cheese from their family, and then that's how they would get through studying, is on the weekend my dad and Mr. Calandra would drive cheese up to my mom and his wife, and she's like, we would study and everyone would be like, what's this cheese? And then, you know, it ended up being
one of the first
career.
Breads I did was with their dried mozzarella. I would get it, and I did a braided
and they knew
loaf
so
stuff
much
with it.
They knew so much. So like, that's the thing, like where I'm talking to you now, and like how you were talking about going down that information thing for your social media, it would be a good way to go. I learned so much just from listening to you talk, and you were so worried about doing this, and you just went and you went off on like, this is what I know, and like you're into giving that knowledge away. And that's what it was like going into Calandra's, where I'd be like, hey, I'm making this, and she's like, all right, well, if you're making pizza, do the cold mozzarella. If you're making mozzarella sticks or the day old for making pizza, because fresh is got too much moisture in it, so it's not going to melt. And then, you know what's funny is they put out a cookbook from the mother, so it would have been Charlie's mom, which is probably where this all came from, if I'm mistaken. But they put out the cookbook because people wanted the recipes for it. And Mrs. Calandra was like, hey, would you mind writing down the recipes? And she gave the wrong recipes and fucked them all up because she didn't want anyone to have it. So people were coming back in the store and they're like, yo, this tastes nothing like
This
it.
is awful.
And they sat down with her and she was like, I was never giving those recipes out. All those are wrong. How funny is that? That like
God.
she was, that generation's like still super protective of it. But that was some of my favorite things. Is when you went in there, it was always busy. How many ropes
They
are
had a
left?
certain smell too.
Yeah.
I loved it.
How many ropes are left? Well, I got this, and like you'd have to call in, and like I want to recreate that with like, even if I do the burgers and stuff up there, like we're talking about like, yo, like, hey, Mike's only doing 100 burgers. Like, hey, can I get a burger? Like that's what I do now for pop-ups here. Like if like. When I sold 100 burgers out of here, I was like, and I did it in 2 days. So I was like, I'm not like, I cut it off and I was like, cool, 50, good, I'm done. Like, I'm not killing myself and hanging out down here for 12 hours. Like, yeah. So like, and then I was like, all right, we'll break it up. And then you create a demand for something and it works way better than having it all the time and sitting around and not doing anything.
Absolutely.
I don't know. I really wish you, I'm going to talk you into doing something here with that.
Well, you talked me into this.
Or at least just taking it and seeing how many sandwiches we can get out of it and maybe start there, because then that's a little bit more simpler of a thing where if you could make 3 of them and like, hey, we can get 40 sandwiches out of here. Then because I really want to take my buddy Angelo's porchetta and do something like with that. And like, that would probably be where to start, because I could just take the bread and make a specific amount. Because what do you think you could get out of that? 3?
Oh, there's a lot. Like when I made it,
12 sandwiches per loaf?
Oh my God, definitely. Well, we sliced it about, what was it, like at least 4 by 3. So yeah, probably about 12.
Yeah. So then that way you just, I mean, and like this is why I like doing it. So I don't know what that math is, but that number, that number.
Wait, 4 times 3 is 12, right?
Yeah. And then so 12 times 3 is what?
Oh my God. 36?
Sure. I don't know. I'm just going to look it up. I'm terrible at math. I've always had
So am I. I never learned it because I changed schools.
Yeah, 36. You were right. So that's 36 sandwiches. So what I would do is be like, I'm only doing 36 of these. And then now it starts being like, oh shit, like I should buy one. If I would tell you, oh, let's just make 100, you don't know where you're going to go with that. So I would prefer doing 36 and being like, hey, this is this sandwich and we're not making it again. Buy it. Like that's what we drive into New York for shit like that. Like Mama's 2, and like my buddy Kevin takes me to all these spots in Philly and New York, or we'll go meet up with Angelo and it's like they're running a special or they're doing something different. Cause Mama's 2 takes makes different style slices and whatnot. So it's like they don't do the same slice all the time. But like if you don't go down there and wait in line, you're not getting it because they always sell out. So I'm like, all right, well, I don't want to do that many because I don't have the proper setup. But even when I do, I'd like to put a cap on it. Cool. We made money. Move on. And then you can work on projects like this with people like yourself, and it'll either give them direction on how to do it themselves, or it's a hobby and you make extra money doing this, and then it's just another extra avenue to be creative.
I like it.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to definitely do that. And if you don't let me do that, I'm just going to buy the bread and do it myself. You absolutely crushed this podcast. I don't know what you were worried about. You were so nervous. This is why I wanted to do this. I figured it would go this way. We can do this again when I talk you into doing that, because I think it would be a fun way to do it. I know Gina has mentioned doing it with breakfast stuff. Cool. You have a killer product. It's crazy that that's what you do on the side and you do that out of your house, because the experience of eating that, if you get to eat that, and anyone who bothers her to pick this food up at the cemetery, it is worth going and doing if you can talk her into it. I want to give you a chance to plug your social media, because your social media is impressive on how clean you keep it and everything, and I think you need to have a little bit more confidence in what you're doing there, because I think you're onto something. It looks like a cookbook. Like that's what it comes off to me. Like the picture wise, like mine's not like that at all. Mine's like a grenade and there's just shit everywhere. But like yours is very stylistic, and I feel like if you continue down that path, whatever you decide to do, I think it's going to wrap up nicely, and you can package it, whether it's a cookbook or anything like that. So I want to give you a time to kind of plug your social media and where anybody can see what you're doing.
What does that mean? Plug it.
Like what's your Instagram?
My Instagram is vicious. Follow me.
What's your because you said you do Snapchat as well. Primarily if somebody wants to.
My Snapchat is private.
All right, so where would you like to direct anyone if they want to watch all the cooking and stuff that you're doing?
My Instagram.
Cool.
That's primarily where I post all of my reels. That's where it's all at.
All right, thank you. You're like, what does that mean? Plug?
What's a plug?
Yeah. It's just usually the time you take to just kind of direct people to where you're going.
Okay.
That's it. If you're a first-time listener, first-time watcher, it's neveragainstudio.com. That has all of the videos, that has all the audio. The apparel you can get through my Instagram. That's Kyle Metz at Dynamite Screen Printing. I work with him directly. If you need me to handle your screen printing or you want to get merch done, contact me and I will direct you with Kyle, and we'll kind of step that out. Subscribe to the YouTube. There's more stuff with cooking and things coming on there. I want to get to 1,000 followers so I can monetize off of it. We're kind of close, but please subscribe to it. Go check her stuff out. Bother her for the bread. If she has time to make it, you will be pleasantly surprised. Thank you so much, and I'm glad you're in Nazareth.
Thank you.
Never Again Radio. Get into it, brother.